I'd like to welcome to the JPP, the Jewish Philanthropy Podcast, a wonderful acquaintance, friend. I don't say old friend anymore because it sounds terrible. but somebody who I know for a very long time, Rabbi Daniel Cohen. Rabbi Daniel Cohen is the senior rabbi in Stamford, Connecticut. I've actually had the great pleasure of knowing him throughout his rabbinical career. He started, if I'm not mistaken, he'll tell us, in Hartford, Connecticut, West Hartford. I didn't know him then, but I did visit him in his kehillah in Denver. And then I've been to his kehillah in Stamford. He's really one of the leading lights in the rabbinate today. He's an author, a published author, an inspirer. His influence goes way beyond just his big kehillah. It goes to Klal Yisrael and really beyond the Jewish people as well. We have him here this morning because he just returned from Israel, but not to talk about that per se, but because he is Senator Joseph Lieberman's from Zecher Tzadik Levracha's rabbi, and we're going to talk to Rav Dani a little bit about himself, and then we'll talk about the Senator. Dani, thank you for making the time, and welcome to
my pleasure. By the way, feelings are mutual about you. I mean, you're a good man, and I wouldn't say an old friend. You're just a good friend, a good soul, and also one of the biggest attributes is that you're a good friend of my brother, Rabbi Ezra Cohen.
That's exactly right. We had to mention that. I was going to mention that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Your brother is a dear friend, a former roommate, and it's a joy to be connected to the extended Cohen. We're not related, and we're not even both Kohanim, if I'm not mistaken.
No.
But it's a joy to share our last name as well. So, Dani, let's get to you. Tell our audience. I always like to ask my guests, just tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words.
I'm a soul, like you, just trying to make the world a better place. I grew up in Atlanta. My dad was a rabbi involved in education and one of 6 kids. My mother, blessed memory, my father always instilled within me a sense that life has meaning, life has purpose, living with a sense of gratitude, and I would say a sense of mission for the Jewish people. So I didn't know that I was going to become a rabbi per se, but when I was in college at Yeshiva University, I felt called a little bit to do some NCSY work, and I loved it. And that really led me to move into the field of not only Jewish education, but the rabbinate. I tried both actually at the beginning of my career after I spent a year studying in Israel, right after I got married to my wife, Diane, who's from South Carolina. Oh, nice. And I really gravitated more towards life in the rabbinate. So I started off as an assistant rabbi with a wonderful mentor, Rabbi Alvin Marcus at the large modern orthodox shul there.
I forgot that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, he's
that's Orange, New Jersey. Wow. Okay.
That's it, on Pleasant Valley Way, and he's just a real people person. And I found that I just enjoyed working with adults. You know, when I was in day school there, I taught for a year at Joseph Kushner and 2 years at Hillel and Passaic, and I wanted the snow days more than the students. They stuck me with the 7th and 8th graders, which is crazy. And I just love doing outreach. And my first position was in West Hartford. But I always had a sense that I wanted to be a rabbi, not only of the, I would say, normative Orthodox community, but I did a lot of outreach work at the same time. That led me then to an opportunity in Denver, Colorado, where I spent a few years at a synagogue that was trying to find itself. In the end, I left there because they were not looking for a change agent. They were looking more for somebody to manage. And then I found myself at a synagogue, which I love, Agudath Sholom. It's a very large modern Orthodox synagogue, but a bit of a throwback when it comes to Orthodoxy. Parking lots open, a very large observant community, but also very welcoming to people, whether they're there every day or they're there just for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Very engaged in the non-Orthodox community, also very engaged in civic life. And that's always driven me, that the mission of being a rabbi is, as Abraham was tasked, to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. So very much of what I do is geared towards not only the Jewish people, but trying to be a light to the world around us.
Amazing. I love that. How long have you been in Stamford already now?
Now my 19th year there, actually.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. In dog years, that's a lot.
Oh, that's impressive. We had the supposed to spend a very long weekend with you a bunch of years ago. A 3-day Shavuos we got to spend with your family and in your congregation. So it was a real treat to see you in action back then. Okay, so one of the great privileges, you have many amazing congregants, and everyone is probably worth a podcast in and of themselves, but we're limited, of course, in time. But one of your most famous congregants of course, is Senator Joseph Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. I think what has been so difficult for so many of us who are a fan of the senator, who had some connection with him, obviously not as deep and as close as you, but obviously when anybody passes away so suddenly, so unexpectedly, it's adds a whole nother level, of course, of trauma and difficulty. And I think, not to get too personal, but I know you experienced this in your own life on a personal note as well, this kind of unexpected type of loss. So maybe just take us back a little bit. Tell us a little bit first about, I understand maybe you were in Israel. Tell us a little bit about the rabbinic role, and then maybe we'll talk more about your personal relationship.
Sure. I mean, I'll be remiss if I didn't just touch a little bit upon what you mentioned before, which is, it's always, very rattling when somebody dies suddenly. As my mom did, as you know, when she died from a brain aneurysm when she was 44 years old, many years ago. But I've always lived, certainly after that moment. And then when I got to the same age as her, with trying to find a way not to have these awakenings go in one ear and out the other, but to really think about, what does that person's life represent? How can I carry that person's light forward so that I'm not leaving Shiva, but I'm transformed in some way by that person's life? And I think in many ways, the loss of Senator Lieberman on both a personal level and rabbinic level is one of those moments in American Jewish history, and one of those moments kind of in life. He was such a remarkable human being that I think it's really, number one, important for us, to reflect on what he meant for people. And, I got to know him, and I'll just kind of start with that a little bit. It's funny. My first exposure to him was I was graduating from Yeshiva University in 1989, and he was the commencement speaker at our Avery Fisher Hall. I think that's where the graduation was. And, it's like so weird that God works in mysterious ways. Who would have imagined at that moment when I was 21 years old that, over 30 years later, he would consider me his rabbi, and I would be delivering his eulogy, which he actually wrote in his will. He wrote a few things in his will. One was that he wanted the Agudath Sholom to be where his funeral would be, because he grew up in Stamford. He wrote in his will that he wanted me to officiate at his funeral, and that he also asked the two sitting senators of Connecticut to be there, Senator Dodd, who was a close friend, and the governor of Connecticut. And he actually moved out of Stamford for most of his political career. He lived in New Haven. Okay. So he would come visit periodically in Stamford. But then about a year after I moved to Stamford in 2005, he moved from New Haven into Agudath Sholom, and he became a regular at our shul. So that's actually how I got to know him, because I would see him all the time. We would spend time together, and what really, I would say, deepened my relationship with him was asking him to write the foreword for my book. The book that I wrote, What Will They Say About You When You're Gone? Creating a Life of Legacy, is all about inspiring people to lead a life of meaning and purpose. And when I thought about who's the most well-known individual that I know that really reflects the values of the book, it was Senator Lieberman. Not only as a politician, but as just a mensch of a mensch. Mm-hmm. And he was gracious enough to agree to be interviewed for the book. That's really where it started. And I got to know him in a much more deeply personal way.
Fascinating. I'll ask an interesting question. I always wonder this. When I've been a pulpit rabbi in a number of stops over the years. I'm not practicing right now, but I always wonder, when somebody has a famous congregant, how do you kind of how do you deal with that? Kind of how do you negotiate that? Like you want to be authentic, you want to be genuine. I know that's your core and your essence as a soul. So you wouldn't be the type of person anyway who would be trying to get friendly with a famous congregant. But what is maybe there's some advice or guidance in terms of others that maybe have famous congregants. I know some of my friends in LA have, certain people that come to their shul on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur that are very well known. How do you go about kind of building an authentic, genuine relationship with people like that?
Look, I think it's important that people that happen to be well known in your congregation, that they never feel like you as a rabbi are using them in any way. and making it a transactional relationship. Just like in any relationship for that matter, 9 out of your 10 interactions with them are just, you're not asking for anything. You're just building friendship. And then you have to be very careful about when you ask them for anything. Look, I got a lot of emails over the years from people that says, I want you to forward this to Senator Lieberman. Can you put me in touch with Senator Lieberman? And, it came all the time. And I was very hesitant, and I rarely forwarded those. If I felt it was something that was meaningful, I sent him an email myself. I never gave out his email and said, is this something you might be interested in? And he was very gracious about it. Like on a couple of occasions, he said no. And on a few occasions, he said yes. And I was able to help people in that way. And I think that I never really asked him for anything per se, other than the opportunity to interview him for this book. And, he understood that at the end of the day, his mission in life is to inspire people to lead lives of legacy. So, in that way, I would say just be a strong pastoral support for the people that are well known in your community without expectation of anything in return, and just be their rabbi and be their friend. And over time, you'll develop trust. And, there may be a moment when they can be helpful to you, not as you, but in you helping fulfill your mission as a rabbi. And generally, if they see that it's coming from that place, they're more than happy to help if they can.
It's an excellent answer. I love that. Excellent answer. I'm curious, you mentioned that the senator had certain requests in his will about his funeral. Were these things that were known to the family in advance, or did they actually only know about it after his passing? Do you know the background of that, or not really?
So I don't. I mean, it was not something you ever really speak about. What happened was nobody thought he would pass away. I saw him actually a few weeks ago. He came to visit some family in Stamford. And as you know, he was very outspoken. Most recently after Senator Schumer spoke out, he wrote an op-ed, and he was involved in No Labels. But I got a phone call from Rabbi Ethan Tucker, who is his stepson, saying the senator had a fall. He was in critical care, unlikely that he would make it. And then I turned to Diane and said, I think I'm going to have to come back. I had no idea yet about the will thing. And then he said to me, Rabbi Tucker, oh, and by the way, he put this in his will that he wanted you to appreciate. So I was going to come anyway. But first of all, I was honored. But when it's a tzava, of a last will and testament.
Right. Mitzvah we have to do everything.
Right. So I don't know what the family knew and didn't know initially, but God works in mysterious ways. So I was up that night till 3 a.m. in the morning, just dealing with funeral issues. And I was able to get a flight about 6 hours later, flew on Thursday morning to America, got there Thursday evening, finished writing the eulogy, all the while I was on the plane being in touch with the enormous task in getting the synagogue ready and security and all sorts of other things. And the funeral was on Friday morning. And it was a true reflection of the kind of life that he led. It was one of the greatest sanctification of God's names, as we were kind of bidding him physical farewell, but recognizing that he was a transformative figure in American Jewish history and really should be serving as a beacon of light on so many levels.
Were you, how involved were you with him on a personal level at the time when he was in fact a candidate for vice president of the United States?
So I didn't really actually know him then, because I was at the time in West Hartford.
Oh, it wasn't
when
okay.
He became, yeah. I mean, I knew him when he was elected again as senator for the second time. He was a member of the Shul and would come in, and that was also just an interesting. First of all, the second time that I had an encounter, when I was the rabbi of the Young Israel West Hartford, and Senator Lieberman was nominated to be the vice presidential candidate, everybody was invited to the Hartford Federation because we were so proud of a local Stamford guy. We all wanted to watch his speech together when he accepted the nomination for being vice president. So I didn't really know him in that context. When I got to Stamford, there were a lot of crazy stories because he was visiting Stamford a lot. His mother lived in Stamford, Marcia Lieberman. And, he would come to the shul, or he was in New Haven, and he was followed on Shabbat by Secret Service, and everybody's got some different stories. But I got to know him more when he was a senator.
Interesting. Okay, tell us a little bit about, tell us a little more specifically about the Levaya, about how do you craft a hesped like that, like in terms of, it's not a rabbinic podcast, but just in terms of maybe some reflections that you shared, what you wanted to impart. That's a big moment, right? You can't, we can have a Chazara now, a review, and maybe I'm sure you've had other thoughts. Maybe I should have said that, or I would have liked to have said that, and just talk a little bit about, I know Al Gore was one of the speakers. It must have been an interesting experience.
So I would say, first of all, I mean, I had the benefit of having some real, as I said earlier, meaningful conversations with him that I think spoke to what I wanted to say. Like, I didn't have, usually when I do a funeral, I'll have kind of an intake session with the family, talk about what's important to them. I didn't have the opportunity to do that. It was all drawn from my own personal interaction with him. Also, people sent me some different stories along the way. Because of the fact that I've been a rabbi here for 19 years, people have shared stories with me along the way. One of the most powerful stories was something that somebody shared with me, which I shared in the eulogy, when Senator Lieberman was here on a Shabbat, and one guy who happened to be visiting from the shul, says, that Senator Lieberman, like, he once winked at me, and it made all the difference in the world. And that was in the eulogy that I gave, and I used it in the eulogy, and it's been quoted. The fellow said, one of the main things that was on my mind was, I was speaking for the Jewish people. I was speaking for people that the senator never even knew, that were inspired by his ability to synthesize Torah in the modern world, unlike any other person of our generation. And a fellow came to me and said, I'll never forget. I always love hearing stories that begin with, I'll never forget. I went to a rally when Senator Lieberman was running for vice president, and I was the only person in the audience with a yarmulke. And I caught the senator's eye, and the senator winked at me. And I'll never forget that wink. And I said the senator, just with a wink, was able to affirm a guy wearing his yarmulke proud at a rally for the vice presidency of the United States. And I said, that's what he did for the American Jewry. He brought religion into the consciousness of Jewry. And nobody could ever say, oh, well, like, how can I observe Shabbat? And I'm going to have to compromise. Maybe I want to play ball and, or do something that in many ways compromises my faith. Senator Lieberman was the model of somebody who said, you know what? You can be running for the highest office, but that doesn't mean you have to compromise your faith. And I was actually thinking about this. There's a famous passage in the Talmud that says that if somebody is good looking and they go to God, and God says, why did you fool around so much? And they say, well, God, you gave me these good looks. I mean, the women couldn't keep their hands off of me. God says, well, look at Yosef, right? He was a very good looking man. And it talks about Hillel, who was poor, or Yehuda Nasi, who was rich. There should be a passage there about Joseph Lieberman that lets somebody say they're running for political office and they can't observe the Sabbath. Joseph Lieberman did it, Maybe that's a Tosefta someday.
That's great. You said that in the announcement? You said that?
No, I didn't say that. I'm just telling you
okay.
that. This is fresh for your podcast.
Fresh material. I love it. I was thinking of two things that I think, maybe we'll talk a little bit about as political philosophy. It was very meaningful to me. I wrote about it. Again, I was further away, but I did have a connection a little bit in the day with Al Gore's daughter. We worked in the same law firm together, but not for now. But two things really stood out to me from afar. One is that I was blessed to have Hannah Lieberman, Hani, I think she went by.
Yeah, Hani. Yeah.
She was my student during college. And a number of times I had the great pleasure of her coming to my office and having some one-on-one conversation with her. And I remember coming home and saying to my wife, I cannot believe that, without knowing the senator, like just knowing him as a public person, I cannot believe that Joel Lieberman has a daughter like this. Like, she was just so religiously committed. And I think she lives in Israel today. I think she spoke at
She does.
I mean, it spoke volumes about who he is, just from the reality of who his daughter was. I just was like, you saw that he had to be a very seriously committed religious Jew from the nature of who his daughter was. That's kind of more on a personal level, but on a professional level, I think it's pretty accurate that if John McCain, the Levracha, had his druthers, in 2008, I hope I have the dates right, he would have picked Joe Lieberman rather than Sarah Palin as his running mate. I think he just couldn't. I think his hands were cuffed. But but can you imagine somebody that would have been historical? I mean, it was historical as it was to be an Orthodox vice presidential candidate, the first Jewish person on a major ticket. He actually very realistically could have been the first vice president on the Republican and a Democratic ticket. I mean, that was a very realistic possibility, which I think speaks volumes to the type of politician he was that unfortunately we don't have enough of today.
Yeah, I mean, look, he was considered a person who really wanted to try to find ways to bring people together. He was a unifier. This was said at his eulogy, not his eulogy, his funeral, that, he was able to disagree without being disagreeable. He understood what it meant to work across the aisle. The irony is, of course, some of the people that were saying that I find are not functioning in that way. But, the model, and I said this also in the eulogy that I gave, of Jewish debate is not for there not to be debate. It says Hillel and Shammai were ideological adversaries, yet their children married each other. God forbid today should someone invite a Republican to a Democratic house or vice versa. And he needs to continue to try to be an inspiration with all of our help to remind ourselves as a country, I mean, what unites us and not what divides us. Israel is plagued with that. I mean, God forbid, should Israel go back to a place of October 6th? You can disagree without hating, without diminishing. And he listened to his higher angels. He's one of the few politicians that everybody could point to and say, you know what? He gets it. He gets it. A nation that is divided is much weaker than a nation that is united.
Interesting. Yeah, I think myself. There's a fear, right? It's very uncomfortable to be in disagreement with somebody else, and we'd rather avoid it and shun it than I think disagree agreeably. So that's really something that's a very, very impressive model. Do you have any thoughts about it? To me, as again from afar, it seems so interesting to me that Al Gore came to speak and to eulogize him. Why did it seem interesting to me? I mean, because frankly, they were running mates together, almost 25 years ago. Obviously they kept a connection. I mean, I don't know. I found it to be very impressive. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. Like maybe they were super close all the years. I have no idea, but I found it like astounding to see kind of this blast from the past. Obviously made the effort to attend and to eulogize and participate.
Yeah. Well, I guess going back a little bit to what you said before, then I'll pull back to Al Gore, is that one of the great strengths of Senator Lieberman is that he was a stranger to no one. That's what I said. He's a stranger to no one. And he had just a warm, pleasant personality. He didn't stand on ceremony. He never allowed his role to be confused with his soul. He just treated everybody, with the utmost respect. And when you treat people with respect and you honor them and you walk in humility, it's a lot easier than to find common ground because people recognize that you just care about them for who they are. And he had a great sense of humor and very warm. And I think that enabled him to disagree without being disagreeable because people couldn't not like Joe Lieberman. That's the point. If somebody comes across as being like, I know better than anybody else, or this is it, you have a problem bringing. But if somebody says, you know what, I've gone out to a movie with this guy, he's been to my Shabbos table, we've hung out together, and you're right, I disagree with him, but I'm not going to hate him. How can I do that? He's a nice guy. So I think with Al Gore, obviously they were very close when he ran for the highest office in the land. I understand. I think Al Gore may have said this, but there were moments when they had disagreements later on. It's not that they always saw, eye to eye, but he recognized that at the end of the day, they were able to transcend those political differences that emerged later on in life. He wasn't the only one. There was another speaker that recognized that as well. It might have been Dodd, I forgot. But the point is that also was what made him so beloved to people, that at the end of the day, he was willing to forgive. If there was a falling out, sometimes in politics, you need to take a stance that really can be hurtful, not because you want to hurt the person, but if somebody is, very focused on this is what I think we need to do politically, and you, as a person of conscience, believe that it has to go the other way, and that person was counting on you to support them.
Right.
It's not so far-fetched for you to take that personally and then the relationship to fall out, but then to come back and say, you know what, I shouldn't have taken it personally. Let's try to make amends. I think the senator and Al Gore were able to do that. And I think the senator, again, people across the aisle, for the most part, really recognized his humanity, his friendship, and you just couldn't get angry at him because he was just such a nice person.
Right. What was the most surprising thing of the entire experience, whether, from the time you got this terrible news through flying back to participating, obviously, and officiating at the funeral? I assume you were at the burial, Shiva house.
Yeah.
What would you say jumped out at you? Maybe the most surprising thing, or maybe the thing that you were maybe not aware of that you really were inspired by?
So I'll tell you, it's interesting. First of all, I flew in from Israel for the Levaya. I got in on a Thursday night. The funeral was on Friday, spent Shabbos, and I, thank God, just had a new granddaughter. So I left Saturday night to fly back to Israel for another 3 days just to be with my family because I was only there for 36 hours. But I would say one point was I did not fully appreciate the reach of all the people and ideas that Senator Lieberman was working on. And I'll give you two. There was a fellow who was one of the pallbearers, and I asked him who he was, and he said he's an investment banker. He's involved in some fund or something. And he said Senator Lieberman was like on our board or like a chair of the board. And I said, I guess Senator Lieberman was your moral compass. He said, yes. And I had no idea why they were there, but I understood that, he, for many people, he was just seen as like he's a bastion of authenticity, of honesty, of truth. And if you can get Senator Lieberman to lend his name or support, it gave it in a real, meaningful way, credence, and it kept people honest. That was, by the way, where I went with my conversation with Senator Lieberman. There are many principles of leading a life of legacy, but one of the most important ones is courageous choices. Like, how do we develop the moral fortitude to make choices based upon principle and not pressure, or based upon conviction and not convenience? And Senator Lieberman was my example, and he said something which I quoted at the funeral, where he said, I don't want to be remembered for playing life safe. I want to be remembered for doing what is right. And this is a conversation that he had with me in 2013 or 14, 10 years ago. Right. So I used that piece, but that was something that touched me, his relationship with these people. The other one was when I was at the burial, there were a number of people that looked like they were from the Middle East or Iran. And I went over to them and said, who are you? And they actually told me they're part of a group in Washington, D.C. that is working within Iran that does not believe that the theocracy there represents, what Iran and what the Iranian people are all about. And they're trying to mobilize a group within Iran to bring out a whole different moderate voice. And they told me that Senator Lieberman has been a strong source of support for fueling that moderation within Iran. And I got their contact info. And again, if we think of Iran, they're fanatics, and you have to address the externalities of the government that's there. But I had no idea that the senator was involved with a group organically that's trying to change the face of Iran from within.
Interesting. Wow. Could you just maybe shed a little bit of light on the things? This is very interesting. Like, just some of the things the senator kind of in his later years, kind of the most recent years, I think he was of counsel at Kazowitz Benson. And yeah, he was on, I think they named something, a new institute for him at YU. Like, what was his focus like in these last recent years? Like, what was he, you mentioned this, this political party he was involved, like what was he really trying to move forward in these last years?
I think that he was a person who was always thinking about legacy and impact. That was what I think what made him such a great person, that he understood his role, his place, but he never kind of rested on his laurels. Take YU, for example, which I made a mention of at the funeral. He in many ways represents the ideal of what YU is trying to produce, a person who is, like it says, Abraham writes that he is ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I'm a stranger and a resident among you. I'm a stranger first. I'm different. I am accountable to God. but I'm also a citizen. I need to be involved in civic life, political life, and to have a either a school or a leadership program named after Senator Lieberman was a way for him to hopefully inspire more people to follow that path. And that's where he was focused on the whole no labels thing, because he felt this country is way too divided, and he felt we have to strengthen the center. The last book that he wrote was about centrism. He came to our show to talk about it, that middle road that's not as exciting as being on the extremes. But at the end of the day, that's actually, I think, what most of America wants. So look, he always felt that if he was given a platform, if he was given wisdom, if he was given political connections and experience, I do believe, and I said this in the eulogy, he didn't wake up every morning asking, what do I want? He was the kind of person that asked himself, what does God want of me? And when you ask yourself that question every day, you're actually able to exponentially increase your impact on the world.
Interesting. Popping into my head also, if I'm not mistaken, that I think I heard this somewhere, that Senator Lieberman would come to the Five Towns for Shabbos. Maybe he had kids here at the time, and he'd often stay by Ambassador David Friedman. I think
That's possible.
they
Yeah,
were
I mean, he did it before Chani and Daniel, his son-in-law, made Aliyah. They lived in the Five Towns. I think that's where he's from. By the way, on that token, when you want to talk about Senator Lieberman, and I said this also, he, was no airs. I mean, he would daven like everybody else. He would drink whiskey and scotch and cholent, and he would schmooze. And he was a good listener. Because you can imagine, by the way, there's only 100 senators in the country. And you come to shul, and you have the ear. Normally, to get the ear of a senator, you get a scheduled appointment. But there were people that would walk over to him with their chest. So, Senator, what'd you think of what happened this week? And they tried to get his ear at Kiddush. And he was pretty good. I mean, people respected his privacy, but there are definitely always people that visited our shul that would try to, really oh, I can talk to the senator now.
Right. It's funny. I have an interesting contrast, which I think brings out what you're saying. And I can't name the personality because it would be very disrespectful. But I was a rabbi in the Upper West Side of Manhattan for many years. And there was I'm just going to say, a very famous political personality who was sitting at Amsterdam Burger, and it was like for lunch. And I was a rabbi of the shul around the corner. So there was literally myself in the restaurant and like three other people, and this very famous person in government who was sitting at a table. And I was like, and at that stage of my life, I was very kind of eye-open. It was very like, wow, exciting. I got to go over and get a photo with him, whatever. So I walk over to him. He's literally sitting there by himself having lunch. Just like interrupted him. Can I just, do you mind if I take a picture with you? And he was very angry. He was like really, really.
He got angry at you?
Like, no, he was like, no. And like, and I just walked away. It was like very deflating. And
Really?
I sometimes occasionally run into Senator Lieberman in Riverside Park. He has children on the West Side, and I would just go over and say Shalom Aleichem, and I'm a fan. And again, it was like you're describing. Like, it wasn't like an intimate conversation, but it was very respectful. It was very polite. He wasn't looking to so like it's not a given what you're saying. That these people are always so open to it. So I'm just bringing the contrast, to the fore. And this person was, at least as substantial as Senator Lieberman, if not more. And he was just, a little bit dismissive. So again, maybe he was having a bad day, but it's just interesting that.
No, I think that it's a wonderful model for all of us, because whether you're a politician or a CEO, or at the end of the day, you're a human being just like everybody else. And I pointed this out, by the way, that on the Shabbat during Shiva, it was the Parsha of Tzav. And the first mitzvah in Tzav is that the Kohen has to lift up the ashes every morning. And the Chovot HaLevavot says the purpose of the Kohen lifting the ashes is to instill humility in the Kohen. Lest he think he's a Kohen, I can't touch the garbage, I can't handle this.
Right.
Just remember, you're like everyone else, and if it's in the service of God, my mother would always say to me when I had to take out the garbage in Atlanta, she'd say, you have an opportunity to do the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em, of honoring your mother and father. And Senator Lieberman got that. And I said, as I was leaving the funeral on that Friday morning, a couple congregants wanted to talk to me. And who was waiting behind this group of congregants? It was Al Gore. He was just standing there waiting to get out. I said, when he was the vice president, do you think he would have waited in line? Like, it's Secret Service, get the vice president out. But he's like everybody else, you know what I'm saying? None of these guys, at the end of the day, they're no great shakes. They're in positions, but
Right.
that's not who they are. And it's important to remember who we are. We're all created in God's image. And Senator Lieberman understood that in spades.
It's great. I was recently was working on trying to get a meeting with somebody who has like multiple gatekeepers.
Yeah.
So my wife, the person literally has like 3 different gatekeepers. I said to my wife, I said, one day when I'm in such a position, I wonder how I'm gonna and my wife was like, don't worry, you'll never be like that person because I will make sure to keep you, I'll keep you very grounded, reminded exactly who you are. But
That's a good wife.
excellent,
Yeah.
excellent point. I know we have to wind down. I know we don't have so much time left. I want to, if I may, just pivot over our remaining
Sure.
5 minutes or so. I want to talk a little bit about, if I can, a little bit about the situation there at Israel. I know you've been to Israel many times recently. You have children that live there. You have grandchildren that live there. I want to give you a shout out also just in terms of the prominence and the importance you put into family. I think it was a value of the senators. It's a value of yours. It's something I aspire toward. You asked me, the first thing you asked me, we got on today was, how's your family? I think it speaks volumes, no matter how busy we are and how important the work we're doing is, to know what comes first. I think that's value. I'd love to hear just a little bit, just your thoughts. Obviously, we're in a very, very complicated, difficult situation. Some impressions that you've had from, I'm Bez Hashem going to be going to Israel for the first time the end of this week after October 7th. I haven't been there in the last 6 months. You've been fortunate to be there. Share with us just some of your thoughts, some of your feelings, some of the experiences, if you're able to.
Sure. When I went to Israel, I could say the first time after October 7th, and I came back, I mean, the way that I described it was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. When you go down to the south and you literally felt you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, it's heartbreaking and still breaks for the horrors that took place. At the same time, the amount of chesed and the amount of hopefully, God willing, unity that will continue, and achdut and spirit of volunteerism is huge. And I think that it's so important for us when I think about our situation, whether it's as Jews in America or Jews in Israel, not to underestimate the significance of little things that we can do that make a difference in the lives of those that are there. When I landed in Israel about a week and a half ago, one of the members of our shul, she's a young woman in seminary. She and a few friends, through a circuitous turn of events, were involved in organizing barbecues for Israeli soldiers. And she had told me, maybe we want to do it, maybe not. We never really got our act together. But then as I got in Jerusalem, I just got off the plane. She said, Rabbi, I double booked for a barbecue right outside of Gaza. Do you think the shul could sponsor the barbecue? So I basically said, sure. And she got a car for me and my wife and a few other students. The first day I was in Israel, to go for about an hour and a half, 2 hours down. And I was serving burgers. I was cutting tomatoes and onions. And there were 300 soldiers that we sponsored to give them food. And the looks in their eyes, because normally they would just get food, rations, whatever it is, were worth so much. Like, they really appreciated the chizuk, just being there. So I would say one of the main messages is, don't underestimate what you can do to try to give people chizuk. This is a time, the past few months, of heightened fear, of heightened anxiety, of heightened despair. And at the end of the day, Hinei lo yanu v'lo yishan shemei Yisrael. The garden of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. The geula will happen b'haref ayin. So the second thing is don't lose faith, because we could spend every day looking at all the news and being filled with anxiety and then be paralyzed from doing anything. But if you get an ask to help, to be there, to give chizuk, to write a letter, to do something, do it. And I would say we're experiencing that right now in Stamford. we had a fellow named Yedidia Harush, which you might have read about. There was an article about him. His family originally was in Sinai. And then when the Jews were taken out of Sinai, his family went to Gush Katif. And then in 2005, he was around 17, 18 years old, and he saw his new home being demolished because the Jewish people had to be sent out. And the government went to him and his family and said, you know what, you don't have to do this anymore. We'll stick you somewhere in central Israel. And he and his family turned to the government and said, we still want to be part of the mission. We still want to be part of the mission. And they worked with JNF to set up a group of cities. One is called Chalutza, right outside the Gaza Strip. And on the morning of October 7th,
I think I heard, I think, if I'm not mistaken, our friend Rabbi Goldberg, Ephraim Goldberg and Boca, may have had people from Chalutza on his podcast. But
yeah, it's possible.
It's a very broad, Egypt,
so he actually came, Yedidia, to our community. He spoke very movingly. And then as I'm walking back with him to lunch, I said, how can we help you? He said to me, well, we have a matzah factory that's in danger of going out of business. So in short order, I decided we would help him out. It was a lot of logistics. And the end result of that is this coming Wednesday, there are 7,000 pounds of matzah from Chalutza that are being shipped and will be housed at the Stamford JCC.
Wow.
And it's now going to be distributed all over the tri-state area. We work with shuls, and he is like so grateful. So from one conversation now, we're helping to revitalize his factory, and there's Jews all over the tri-state area and New Hampshire, actually, that are getting his matzah. So we all can make a difference. We're all chalutzim, literally. If we're going to be in America, we can't just sit idly by during this time. We have to do something because we never know, what light that we ignite that will actually maybe be the catalyst for a much better day for the Jewish people.
I appreciate that so much. I think my wife and I last night, we were privileged to go to a Hanan Ben Ari concert in Brooklyn with about 3,000 other Jews in unity. And Hanan himself, members of his band, were murdered on October 7th. Members of his group, two of them he mentioned are in captivity as we speak. And I think many of us are longing for connection, longing to do something, to be part of Am Yisrael in these trying times. And it's not always as apparent or obvious kind of how we can help or how we can make a difference. And I think many of us are longing for these opportunities. So those like yourself were facilitating them. Kol hakavod. Rabbi Daniel, I want to thank you so much. This was a very,
Thank you for the opportunity.
It was great. Thank you so much.